In an age when faith could brand you a traitor, one woman's silence defied an empire. Margaret Clitherow, a simple butcher's wife, faced the most excruciating punishment ever recorded. Pressed beneath stones for 72 hours and still conscious. Her death was not quick nor merciful. It was designed to erase belief itself. But her endurance turned execution into legend. This is not myth. This is the story of how one woman's unbroken silence outlasted the cruelty of a kingdom. In the waning chill of an Elizabethan winter, the city of York lay under a sky the color of pewter. The Reformation had bled through England like a wound that would not close. Churches once filled with Latin hymns now echoed the stern silence of Protestant rule. And amid this tension, between loyalty and conscience, between survival and belief, lived Margaret Clitherow, a butcher's wife whose faith had become a crime. She was not a revolutionary. Her world was small. The shambles were her husband. Sold meat, the narrow alleyway that smelled of salt and frost, the quiet murmur of her children's laughter. Yet beneath that ordinary life stirred something forbidden, an unwavering devotion to the old faith. While her neighbors whispered psalms approved by the crown, Margaret's prayers remained Catholic. In the eyes of Elizabeth's law, that made her an enemy of England. To harbor priests, to hear mass, to own a rosary, each was an act of treason. The Queen demanded allegiance not only of body but of soul. Those who refused were crushed not by sword or gallows, but by a colder machinery: courts, informers, silence. Spies walked among the devout, listening at doors, counting candles, reporting confessions. Margaret's home became both sanctuary and trap. She opened her doors to hunted priests who wandered the countryside disguised as merchants, their hands trembling with fear as they carried chalices wrapped in rags. Behind the walls of her small house on the Ouse Bridge, she built a hidden chamber, a space no larger than a coffin, where mass was whispered in the dead of night. Each knock upon the door became a trial of the heart. Each candle lit in prayer felt like defiance. Neighbors began to avoid her. The butcher's wife who prayed too often, too quietly, with eyes that seemed always to look beyond the living. Children were told not to linger near her stall. In taverns, men muttered her name with uneasy reverence, that woman of York who harbors the forbidden. Yet she did not hide. When questioned by the local constable, she neither denied nor confessed. "I do nothing against conscience," she said, her voice calm. It was not rebellion she sought, but the freedom to believe in silence. But in 1586, silence was the greatest crime of all. When rumors reached the ears of the Council of the North, the Queen's enforcers, her name was marked. The order was signed for a search of her home. Soldiers were to enter without warning, to seize all relics of the Roman faith. That night, as Margaret prepared the evening meal, she paused at the faint sound of footsteps outside. Torches flickered beyond the frost-glazed windows. She knew before they knocked. Her husband looked up, pale, his knife halfway through the carving block. She touched his arm. "Say nothing," she whispered. The door shuddered under the weight of authority. Iron boots scraped the threshold. In that moment, between the knock and the command, she understood the full reach of her defiance, that faith had become her death sentence, and prayer, her final rebellion. The Queen's justice had found her at last. The heart of Margaret Clitherow's defiance lay not in the marketplace nor the gallows, but in the hidden silence of her own home. Beneath her roof, the smell of meat from her husband's shop mingled with incense and candle smoke. Behind a false wall, she had built a secret chapel, no bigger than a cupboard, its stones cool and close, its light trembling like faith itself. There, forbidden Latin hymns rose and fell in whispers, the words echoing through the cracks of the floorboards into a world that would kill her for saying them aloud. Every Sunday, neighbors thought they heard the clatter of dishes or the laughter of children. In truth, it was the murmur of a mass outlawed by Elizabeth's crown. The priest, barely older than a boy, trembled as he lifted the chalice. Margaret knelt beside him, her hands steady despite the risk. Around her, women pressed their rosaries tight enough to leave marks in their palms. They all knew one mistake, one careless noise, could summon death to the door. York, in those years, was a city of spies. Paid informers lingered in taverns, listening for stray Latin prayers, for the mention of any name whispered too reverently. The Queen's laws were clear. To shelter a priest was treason. To attend a hidden mass was the same as raising arms against the throne. Yet every week, Margaret did both, armed only with faith and the courage to use it. It was a cold March morning when the betrayal came. Snow had turned to slush along the cobbled street, and the sky hung low, gray and heavy. A knock thundered against the door, a sound too sharp, too deliberate. Margaret's breath caught. The priest froze mid-prayer. Another knock, louder this time. "Soldiers, open, by order of the Queen." Her children screamed as boots splintered the threshold. Margaret rose from her knees, pressing her hand to the secret wall. "Hide," she whispered. The young priest hesitated, his face pale with terror. She pushed him inside, sealing the panel with a quiet snap just as the first guard entered the room. They tore through her house with merciless precision. Drawers overturned, chairs broken, walls struck with pikes until hollow thuds betrayed the truth. When they found the hidden chapel, the lead soldier laughed a sound that cut through the air like a blade. "God hides poorly in this house," he sneered. The false wall was ripped open. The priest was dragged out, eyes wide, clutching the chalice as if it were his heartbeat. The guards struck him down, spilling consecrated wine across the floorboards. Margaret tried to reach him, but two men seized her arms. Her eldest son cried, "Mother, please," but was thrown aside. Margaret said nothing. She only watched as they smashed her altar, scattering fragments of faith across the dirt. One soldier spat on the cross that had hung above it. When they bound her wrists, the sheriff himself arrived to read the charge, harboring traitors to the crown and practicing the Romish faith. Margaret's voice was soft, steady. "If faith is treason, then I am guilty." The sheriff hesitated. He had seen many criminals, thieves, killers, men who begged and cursed, but never a woman who met death as if greeting an old friend. "Take her," he ordered, though his tone faltered. As the guards led her away, the priest cried out through his bloodied lips, "Forgive them, mistress." Margaret turned once, her face serene despite the ruin. "They know not what they do," she whispered. Outside, the bells of York Minster tolled for morning prayer. The same sound that sanctified the Queen's church now echoed over the arrest of the butcher's wife who dared to love God her own way. Her fate was sealed. Her silence had only just begun. The courtroom in York was a cold place, all stone and echo, the kind of silence that turned breath to mist. Margaret Clitherow stood at its center, small against the towering judge's bench, her wrists bound but her gaze unbroken. Her crime was clear to the crown. She had harbored outlawed priests, hidden relics, and defied the Protestant law of Her Majesty, Elizabeth. But her true offense, as the court soon realized, was her refusal to speak. When asked for her plea, she only lowered her head. The clerk repeated the question. Still, she said nothing. To confess would condemn the priests she had sheltered. To deny would mock her faith. Her silence was her final act of defiance, when the judges could neither ignore nor understand. "Speak, woman," demanded the recorder of York, slamming his hand upon the table. "You stand accused of treason and harboring traitors. Plead guilty or not guilty before this court." Margaret lifted her eyes at last. "I will be judge," she said softly, "by God alone." The room fell still. Even her accusers seemed unsettled by the calm that clung to her words. For a long moment, the only sound was the quill scratching across parchment as the clerk noted her refusal. By English law, her silence meant the trial could not proceed. But the crown could not allow her defiance to spread. The judges whispered among themselves, invoking an ancient punishment, one so cruel it had not been used for generations. Peine forte et dure, the pressing of the body by weights until the accused either entered a plea or died beneath the burden. The sheriff, reading the sentence aloud, faltered as the words left his tongue. The prisoner shall be laid upon the ground, her body placed beneath a door, and as much weight laid upon her as she can bear, until she speak or until she die. Gasps rippled through the court. Even hardened men flinched. One guard muttered, "It's a death fit for beasts, not women." But the decree was signed. Margaret bowed her head, her expression neither proud nor afraid, only resolute. "May my silence speak more loudly than your sentence," she said. The judge's gavel struck wood. The sound echoed like a tolling bell, final, hollow, irreversible. As she was led away, a young woman in the crowd cried out, "She's innocent. She only prayed." A soldier struck her to the floor. Margaret turned her head slightly, her eyes finding the girl's. "Pray still," she whispered before being dragged from the chamber. Outside, the streets of York buzzed with rumor. Some said the butcher's wife had cursed the court with her silence. Others claimed angels would lift the stones from her body. But among the guards, a different fear spread, not of God, but of duty. For it would fall upon them to press her down, to feel the slow breaking of a body that refused to beg. That night, in the cold stone corridors beneath the courthouse, Margaret was placed in chains. The sheriff visited her once, hoping to spare his conscience. "Say a word," he pleaded, "and I'll see you spared this torment." Margaret smiled faintly. "Would you have me trade their lives for my own?" He said nothing more. When he left, she knelt upon the floor, her prayer unspoken, her faith unbroken. Above her, the bells of York Minster rang for evening mass, the Queen's Mass, not hers. Yet she prayed all the same. Tomorrow her silence would become her cross. The air in the cell was heavy, thick with damp earth and the bitter scent of rusted chains. Beneath the old toll house, the walls sweated moisture, their stones blackened by centuries of despair. Margaret Clitherow was led there by two guards who spoke little. Their torches flickered, casting shapes that looked like ghosts crawling up the walls. When they unbound her wrists, her skin was raw, purpled where the ropes had bitten. Yet she did not cry out. She only touched the cold floor, as though greeting it like an old friend. The cell was barely large enough to kneel. A thin slit in the wall let in a breath of night air, sharp as knives. Somewhere above, the sound of boots echoed, preparations, voices murmuring about stones, doors, and measures of iron. The sheriff's men were building her grave, though they called it justice. Margaret prayed. Her words were not for deliverance, but for endurance. "Let me not break, Lord," she whispered, "lest my silence lose its meaning." Hours passed. The torch burned low. From the corner of the cell, a rat scurried, bold with hunger. When the door creaked open again, a jailer stepped inside, young, nervous, his pity worn thin by duty. He carried a crust of bread and a small cup of water. "Speak a plea," he murmured, his voice trembling, "and they'll spare you this. Say you are guilty or not, it matters not which. Say something." Margaret turned toward him, the light touching her hollowed face. "My words," she said, "would kill others." He stared at her for a long moment, then set the water down beside her and left without a word. The hours bled into one another. From above, faint bells began to ring, the Queen's Mass, carried by the wind. For Margaret, it was a sound from another world. She had attended such bells once, long ago, before her faith became rebellion. Now the sound was both comfort and wound. When she tried to sleep, the stone floor drew the heat from her body. Her breath hung in the air like smoke. The chill gnawed at her bones, but she kept her hands clasped, her lips moving silently in prayer. Through the narrow slit of the wall, she saw dawn's first gray light. With it came footsteps, the measured tread of men with a purpose too grim to name. Outside, frost covered the yard where the toll house stood. 2 men poured buckets of water over the ground, washing away the stains of executions past. The water turned red as it ran into the cracks. One soldier crossed himself before realizing the sheriff was watching. "Do your work," the sheriff barked, though his voice held little authority. By mid-morning, the chamber floor was ready, flat stones laid upon the earth, a heavy wooden door nearby, and iron slabs stacked like offerings. It was a place meant for breaking the spirit as much as the body. When the guards came for her, Margaret rose without resistance. The jailer from the night before avoided her eyes. He held the cell door open, his hand trembling on the latch. "Forgive us," he whispered as she passed. She said nothing. Outside, the air was cold enough to bite. The frost cracked beneath her bare feet as she walked toward the toll house floor, her silent procession to martyrdom. The city of York still slept, unaware that history itself was about to wake. Dawn came pale and merciless over York. The streets were empty save for a few curious eyes watching from the shadows. Beneath the toll house roof, the air hung thick with frost and fear. A wooden door, rough-hewn and stained from years of use, lay upon the ground. Around it, men moved in silence, guards, masons, and the sheriff himself, each performing a grim ritual they could neither question nor escape. Margaret Clitherow was led in through the side gate, her bare feet leaving faint prints in the frost. Her shift clung to her from the cold, thin fabric against the breath of morning. She did not shiver. When the sheriff offered her one last chance to speak, to plead, to confess, to live, she only shook her head. Her silence, gentle and terrible, unnerved them all. A priest stood hidden among the onlookers, disguised as a townsman. His lips moved with trembling prayers as he watched her kneel upon the ground. The sheriff cleared his throat, reading from a parchment that seemed to weigh as much as the stones they would soon carry. "Margaret Clitherow, you are sentenced under the law of peine forte et dure, to be pressed with heavy weights until you speak or until your breath leaves you." The guards hesitated. No one wanted to be the first. Finally, one man stepped forward, laying a rough stone beneath her back to arch her spine. Margaret closed her eyes. "Jesu mercy," she whispered, almost soundless. A wooden door was then placed upon her, the same that once guarded the toll house gate. The sheriff nodded. The first weights were brought, iron slabs used to test cartloads, cold and slick from the frost. As the first was lowered onto the door, the air filled with the creak of wood and the faint, sharp sound of cracking ribs. Margaret's body jerked, her breath cut short, but no scream followed. One of the men turned away, muttering a curse under his breath. Another crossed himself and whispered, "God forgive us." The sheriff's voice quivered. At the next, a second weight fell into place. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, her lips moving in prayer. The pressure forced the air from her lungs, leaving only a rasp, but her eyes, those eyes remained open. She looked at no one, as though gazing beyond them all. Outside, the wind howled through the streets, carrying with it the sound of church bells. For the watchers within the toll house, time began to warp. Each breath, each groan of the wooden planks, a reminder of their own mortality. After a while, the sheriff gestured for the men to pause. "If she will speak, let her speak now," he said. Margaret tried to lift her head, but the weight held her down. Blood trickled from her nose, darkening the frost beneath. Her voice, when it came, was no louder than a sigh. "I pray for you all." Then she closed her eyes again. The sheriff lowered his head, the parchment in his hand shaking. "May God witness that we have done our duty," he muttered, though no one believed the words. The toll house door groaned under its load. The crowd began to murmur, a mix of horror and awe. What they had expected to end quickly became something else entirely, a trial of endurance, of faith against flesh. By noon, Margaret still lived. The sheriff turned away, unable to watch any longer. "Enough for today," he ordered. "Keep her alive until morning." But as the guards stepped back, one whispered, almost in reverence, "She will not die." Not yet. And he was right. Night settled over York like a heavy shroud, pressing down on the toll house just as the stones pressed down upon the woman beneath them. Inside, the air had grown stagnant, thick with the mingled scents of sweat, iron, and damp straw. The flicker of torches made the shadows tremble across the walls. But Margaret Clitherow lay utterly still, her body half hidden beneath the wooden door. Her skin drained of color, her breath barely perceptible. It had been nearly 20 hours since the first weight was set upon her. The guards who had been ordered to remain by her side were no longer men, only hollow vessels of duty, their hands shaking, their eyes red from sleeplessness. They had seen executions before, but never one so slow, so deliberate, so intimate in its cruelty. "She's still alive," one whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. The sheriff, pacing near the wall, turned sharply. "Then God wills her silence," he said, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. Margaret's lips moved, forming shapes without sound. The priest hidden among the servants, the same man who had watched her in secret that morning, knelt behind a pillar and prayed under his breath. "Holy Mary, Mother of Mercy, intercede for her." But even prayer seemed small here. The chamber was no place for grace. It had become a wound in the heart of the city. Her body had begun to darken where the iron bore down. Purple bruises spread like ink across her arms and ribs. The skin along her neck pulsed weakly with every fading heartbeat. Yet somehow, breath still found its way through the crushing door. In delirium, she murmured the names of her children, Henry, William, Anne, her voice ghost-like, each name a plea that trembled between this world and the next. Outside, townsfolk had begun to gather. Rumors spread like fire. The butcher's wife lives still. The stones cannot kill her. Some said she was a witch, cursed with unnatural endurance. Others whispered she was blessed, her suffering proof of divine favor. But whether in pity or superstition, they came men, women, even children, drawn by the terrible gravity of a faith that would not die. As the night deepened, the sheriff ordered another stone brought in. The guards hesitated, glancing toward Margaret's motionless form. "Sir," one said quietly, "there's no sense in adding more. Her soul is already gone." "Do as the law commands," came the cold reply. The iron slab clanked against the others as it was lowered. The sound echoed like thunder in the narrow chamber. Margaret's body shuddered, a small involuntary tremor, then went still again. For a heartbeat, everyone thought it was over. Then came a faint, wheezing breath, thin but defiant. The sheriff's face blanched. He turned away, whispering, "This is not justice. This is penance." Through the long hours that followed, the toll house became a place of uneasy vigil. The torches burned low. Men dozed where they stood, their dreams filled with the sound of cracking wood and shallow breaths. Near dawn, a cold wind slipped through the cracks of the door and made the torches flicker. The priest, unable to bear it any longer, pressed his hand to the ground and whispered, "Go, daughter, your suffering is seen." But Margaret did not go. Her breathing, ragged and faint, continued, proof that will could endure beyond pain, beyond mercy, beyond reason. When the first light of morning crept through the window, it fell upon her face. Her lips were parted in a faint smile. She was still alive. By the second morning, the streets of York throbbed with rumor. Word had spread beyond the toll house walls, the woman still breathes. Merchants halted their carts to listen. Priests muttered in disbelief. Housewives crossed themselves before speaking her name aloud. Margaret Clitherow had become both horror and legend, a martyr made not by miracles, but by endurance. Outside the toll house, the winter mist clung to the stones like shrouds. People gathered in the narrow lanes, drawn by a force they could neither explain nor resist. The soldiers stationed at the gate tried to disperse them, but whispers rose faster than commands. "She's still alive. 70 hours, they say. God himself keeps her heart beating." Inside, the chamber was a world of breath and silence. The sheriff sat in a corner, head bowed, hands trembling as though he bore the weight himself. Around him, the guards stood motionless, faces gray with exhaustion. No one dared meet Margaret's eyes, for even half buried beneath wood and stone, she watched them. Her gaze, unfocused yet unbroken, was a mirror of their own guilt. Her chest moved in shallow waves, each breath scraping against crushed ribs. Her lips were pale blue, her face ghostly. But still, life clung to her like a curse that refused release. Every whisper from outside seeped through the cracks in the door. Prayers, pleas, and the murmurs of awe. At one point, a mother pressed her child against the toll house wall, whispering, "Remember her name, for she dies for her faith." Others spat curses, calling her prideful, a fool who sought sainthood through rebellion. York had become a city divided between reverence and revulsion. The guards, unnerved by the crowd, sought permission to end it quickly. "Let us strike her neck," one begged. It would be mercy. But the sheriff shook his head, his voice hollow. "The law forbids it. The Queen's justice must be done in silence." Margaret stirred faintly beneath the crushing weight, a sound escaping her, not a cry, but something softer, like a sigh of release. One of the guards dropped his torch in fright, the flame flaring across the dirt before dying out. For a long moment, all was still except for her faint, rasping breath. Then came the murmurs again, she lives still." The sheriff slammed his hand against the wall, shouting, "Enough!" But even he could not silence what had already become legend. Night fell once more. Outside, the tolling of bells marked another hour gone. Inside, a soldier, the youngest among them, knelt beside her. His tears fell onto the wooden door as he whispered, "Forgive us." Her eyelids fluttered. Perhaps she heard him. Perhaps she didn't. By now, she had endured more than anybody should. Her silence had become an act of defiance greater than any sermon. Her pain, a sermon of its own. When dawn broke on the third day, frost covered the toll house stones. The crowd was still there, sleepless, haunted, waiting for the sound of death that would not come. The sheriff looked upon her once more and whispered, "She outlasts us all." And somewhere in the hollow quiet, beneath the weight of faith and iron, a heart still beat. Dawn arrived without warmth, its light thin and colorless, filtering through the frost-coated window of the toll house. 3 days had passed since the crushing began, and yet Margaret Clitherow's heart still beat beneath the weight meant to silence her. The chamber had grown deathly still, save for the occasional creak of timber and the faint rattle of her breath. The executioners stood in a semicircle, pale as ghosts. Their faces bore the shadows of men who had not slept, haunted by the task that refused to end. The sheriff, slumped in a chair, stared at the wooden door resting on her chest as though it were a coffin lid for them all. When one of the men spoke, his voice cracked. "Sir, she lives still." The sheriff's eyes lifted, hollow and red. "Then God refuses her rest." He rose with effort, his legs trembling beneath him. Each step toward the woman felt like a step deeper into damnation. Her lips were slightly parted, her eyes open, not pleading, not afraid, only aware. There was no hatred in her gaze, only the quiet, unbearable knowing of someone who has already crossed beyond pain. The priest who had watched in secret for days pressed himself deeper into the shadows. He dared not speak, but his prayer filled the silence. "Lord, be swift. End her agony or ours." Outside, the crowd still murmured, an ocean of whispers swelling beyond the toll house walls. Mothers held their children close. Men removed their caps in reverence or guilt. Every soul in York knew what was happening beneath that roof, and none could look upon the sunrise without seeing her in it. "Bring the last of it," the sheriff ordered softly. The words fell like stones themselves. 2 men entered, bearing the final iron slabs, heavy, dark, and cold as judgment. The floorboards groaned as they set them down. The sheriff's hands shook violently as he reached to touch the top of the wooden door, feeling the faint, rhythmic pulse beneath. He hesitated. For the first time, his voice broke. If she were guilty, God would have taken her by now. "Then finish it," murmured one of the guards, tears cutting lines through the soot on his cheeks. "Let her find heaven." Margaret's lips moved, just barely. The sheriff leaned close enough to hear. Her voice came thin, cracked by days without breath. "Lord, receive me." The sound of it stilled the entire room. No one moved. No one dared breathe. Then, with a trembling hand, the sheriff gave the nod. The last stones were lowered. A hollow thud echoed, deep and final. For an instant, nothing changed, and then her body gave one small tremor, as if exhaling the last remnant of her soul. A gasp rippled through the men. One fell to his knees. Another turned away, covering his face. The sheriff stood frozen, staring at the motionless form beneath the door. No priest read a prayer. No crowd cheered. There was only the faint groan of the wooden boards, settling under their burden. When it was done, the sheriff whispered hoarsely, "May God forgive England." And outside, as the bells of St. Mary's tolled across York, the wind carried her silence farther than any sermon could. When the men returned at dusk, the toll house was colder than any churchyard. The air no longer carried the groans of timber or the faint sound of prayer. Only silence remained, thick, absolute, and sacred in its weight. They stood around the door, unwilling to move, each man aware that what lay beneath was not just a body, but something far heavier than stone. The sheriff gave the order quietly. 2 men lifted the planks, slow and trembling, as if disturbing a saint's tomb. The air that escaped from beneath was warm, impossibly warm, and carried the faint scent of iron and candle wax. Beneath it, Margaret Clitherow's body lay crushed and still, yet her face was serene. Her lips held the ghost of a smile, her eyes closed as though she had merely fallen asleep mid-prayer. One guard stumbled backward. "She looks alive," he whispered. Another crossed himself, muttering that no mortal should die so calm. The sheriff knelt. His gloved hand brushed the edge of her cloak, the same fabric that had been torn and soiled during the trial. He had seen 100 corpses before, but none that felt like judgment itself. Her ribs had collapsed inward, her hands still clasped. No scream had escaped her. No word of defiance had broken her vow. He turned to his scribe. "Write it down," he said hoarsely. "She endured. Nothing more." The pen scratched against parchment, its sound sharp in the hollow air. Those 2 words, "she endured," would outlive every man in that room. Outside, dusk had fallen over York. The frost on the cobblestones gleamed red in the last light of day. The townsfolk, who had gathered in fearful curiosity, stood in silence now, their torches lowered. Mothers wept softly, their tears steaming in the cold. Children were shushed by trembling hands. Even the drunkards near the tavern held their tongues, unwilling to curse in the presence of what felt like divine reckoning. Inside, the sheriff ordered her remains to be wrapped in white linen. As they did so, one of the executioners noticed something strange. The faint impression of the wooden door marked her body like a cross. None spoke of it. None dared. When they carried her out, the torches flickered, though there was no wind. Her passage through the street was met with bowed heads and murmured prayers. "A martyr," someone whispered. "A fool," said another. But their voices were uncertain. as if afraid the stones themselves might hear. By midnight, the toll house was emptied, its floor scrubbed clean. Yet no amount of washing could erase the faint outline of where she had lain. The frost melted only there, leaving a damp shadow in the shape of a woman. The sheriff returned alone to that spot before dawn. He knelt where her head had rested and whispered, "I did as the law commanded." The silence that followed was so deep it felt alive. He rose quickly and left, never to speak of her again. Weeks later, the city still carried her memory like a wound. Some claimed that on quiet nights, if you stood near the toll house and pressed your ear to the ground, you could still hear a faint rhythm, not quite wind, not quite heartbeat. Perhaps it was the earth remembering. Or perhaps it was the conscience of a nation learning too late how long a woman can stay alive beneath its laws.